I've got a question for you. What would happen if Ronald Reagan came back to life and met Donald Trump in the Oval Office? Do you think they'd become friends? Do you think they'd shake hands and find common ground with similar values and political beliefs? Of course, both are considered die-hard conservatives, both are considered a boogeyman for liberals, and both had a career in show business. But in fact, this is kind of where the similarities stop. Ronald Reagan's job as president was to fight the worst recession since the Great Depression, and to do so, he promised the Reagan Revolution, the so-called revolution focusing on reducing government spending, taxes, as well as regulation.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
President Reagan liked the free market and believed that capitalism would solve the nation's problems. He also liked to portray himself as a humble, paternal figure. In other words, he prided himself on being a man of high moral values.
Would be unmistakable. Open this gate.
Donald Trump, however, is a totally different animal. He shows off his fortune, his former model trophy wife, and he is so obviously the opposite of a paternal figure.
Donald Trump.
He's more like that weird uncle living like a bachelor regardless of his age and getting embarrassingly drunk during family reunions.
Build a wall. Renegade.
On the policy side, Trump is seldom friendly toward the free market and small government. He loves debt, the idea of trade wars, and his protectionist policy of taking care of America seems to be at odds with the GOP's tendency to be in favor, at least in theory, of the free market.
America. Fuck yeah.
As you can probably see, there is a clash that runs deep in the soul of the Republican Party. Or at least this is how it looks from an outside perspective. On the one hand, there's this, the good old party that loves America, small government, low taxes, and conservative values. And then there is this other Republican Party that loves trophy wives, big beautiful walls, and tariffs.
He's a millionaire.
And who's winning? Well, you guessed it.
There is a wave of Republicans leaving Congress.
Among all these differences in values and policy, the news cycle has been completely taken over by a new wave of Republicans. And who is the most important of them all? Well, that would actually be Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House and the Republicans' golden boy. For years, Paul Ryan was the champion of fiscal rectitude and small government. And now he's announced that he's not going to run for re-election. And as you can imagine, he's not the only one. Many Republicans might be leaving, but there are always new elections, and therefore new candidates, but also ones with questionable characters. Take, for example, the Alabama special elections held back in December of 2017.
Trump-backed candidate Roy Moore was buried under tons of allegations of sexual abuse of minors. After these scandals, Republicans lost the seat in Alabama for the first time in decades. But the biggest surprise is that a Republican president supported an alleged sexual predator. Could you imagine something like this just 5 years ago? As you could expect, this Alabama scandal appeared on all the national newspapers and hit the White House.
And now you might wonder, well, what did Donald Trump do to solve this PR crisis? Well, he did absolutely nothing. Nothing at all. And this is one of the reasons why so many Republican candidates are doing so badly in the polls, even in traditionally red states. But what does this mean for the White House? Well, for those who don't keep up with American politics so much, this year the country had legislative elections. These are the so-called midterms. This is when members of Congress and many senators are elected. In America, the president, that is the executive power, is voted in during one election and the legislative power during another. This is why, for example, despite Obama being Democrat, the majority of the legislative chambers were Republican. And if the Republicans lose too many seats during the 2018 midterms, Trump is going to be in dire straits anytime he wants to pass a bill. But the real question now is, how did the Republican Party get here? Can a political party change their ideology this quickly? Well, today we're going to answer these questions, but before we do, let's take a look back at the history.
The Reagan Revolution.
Ronald Reagan started out as a registered Democrat and a New Deal supporter, but he left the party in 1962, crossing over to the GOP, stating that he didn't leave the Democratic Party, but it was the party that left him. Nevertheless, things in the GOP were not ideal either. According to Reagan, Republicans had bought into most of the values of the Democratic platform. And despite the passionate rhetoric, there was some truth to that. Have you ever heard of cultural hegemony? This is a concept Marxist philosophers like to use a lot. According to them, the ruling class needs to create a consensus, a set of moral values that are shared by the majority of the political players, including the opposition party. Back then, ideas like the welfare state and the need for more governmental control of the economy became the new mainstream. Even the Republicans had to accept those principles if they wanted to be considered a serious power. This explains why both Nixon and Eisenhower did very little when it comes to economics. And you guessed it, Reagan was not a big fan of this.
No nation in history has ever survived a tax burden that reached a third of its national income. Today, 37 cents out of every dollar earned in this country is the tax collector's share.
But here comes the interesting part. Cultural hegemony is something that changes over time. How? Well, when those values are no longer solving people's problems. This is what happened in the 1970s with the energy crisis. America was really not in a good place back then. And this was the window of opportunity that Ronald Reagan needed to reinvent the Republican Party and create the ideological platform we used to know as conservatism. In other words, he took something old and made it shiny again by more or less creating a brand new ideology. But the real question is, well, how do you do that? How can you create a brand new ideology that makes sense and lets you win elections? Well, let me introduce you to the theory of the empty signifier. Basically, Ronald Reagan went to all the political groups that fell outside of the political mainstream at the time. He spoke to the evangelical conservatives for one, he spoke to the military-industrial complex guys for another, and finally, he spoke to everybody who was tired of paying so many taxes. Then he merged all of these groups into one common cause: liberty and freedom. This is what we call an empty signifier. It's a concept so vague that everybody can project onto the vagueness the meaning that they're looking for. For a fiscal conservative, freedom means being free from paying so many taxes. For a hawkish conservative, freedom means fighting authoritarian rulers.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
But think about it. How is it possible to have people so different from one another on the same platform? It's a big-time contradiction to have someone who wants smaller government and someone else who wants to increase military spending, right? Well, if you want to create a political identity, you need an antagonist, and Ronald Reagan, he couldn't have had it easier.
Open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Yep, he picked the evil communists. This is why during the 1980s there were so many movies where the communists were the bad guys. Here you have titles like Red Dawn, Rocky IV, and of course, Top Gun. All of these movies, along with Reagan's speeches, helped create a brand new cultural hegemony. Even Democratic presidents like Clinton had to promise tax cuts in order to win elections. But as you know, the Soviet Union, it fell in the 90s. So what happens when you lose your antagonist? Well, you simply find another one. Like President Reagan did 2 decades before, President Bush operated from a Christian worldview that distinguishes between good and evil. After the tragedy of September the 11th, President Bush announced that the battle ahead would be a monumental struggle of good versus evil, but good will prevail. And that's how the so-called evil became America's new enemy.
We will rally the world to this cause by our efforts, by our courage. We will not tire, we will not falter, and we will not fail.
Of course, I'm not saying that terrorists or communists are not evil or that they are just some sort of fabricated monster. Of course not. But they can be utilized to create a political platform. Every important politician they've done it. Roosevelt did it, Reagan did it, Bush did it, but what happens when you run out of enemies? What happens when the Soviet Union is no more, or when Bin Laden is dead? Well, this is the time for...
Damn. The Trump Revolution.
After the 2008 financial crisis, the economic mainstream and the cultural hegemony was once again challenged, resulting in people not trusting the economic mainstream anymore.
The word didn't spread through mainstream media, and immediately the question arose whether or not the lack of coverage was because it wasn't newsworthy, or because some of the people being protested against have the control over the various mainstream media outlets. On September 30th, we took a trip into the city to see what wasn't being talked about.
When people lose faith in something, that usually leaves a void that needs to be filled by a new kind of discourse. And here sweeps in candidate Donald J. Trump with his inflammatory speeches during campaign rallies, all his personal scandals, and his scorching and polarizing public statements. Once again, a new presidential candidate managed to ally himself with an astounding variety of political and religious groups that felt misrepresented by the mainstream. In fact, 80% of evangelical Christians voted for Trump, much more than any other religious group. Evangelical Christian values are about family and moral integrity, so why is a guy like Trump, with all his divorces and sexual scandals, not perceived as immoral by them? Well, even in the light of the recent media storm surrounding the alleged hush payment to silence porn star Stormy Daniels, 78% of evangelical voters still support Trump. Some evangelical leaders went as far as publicly stating that they have given the president what they call a mulligan, a do-over. A mulligan is a golf metaphor which is strangely appropriate considering Trump's passion for that sport.
Yes, evangelical conservatives gave him a mulligan. They let him have a do-over. They said, "We will start fresh with you and give you a second chance." Tony Perkins, speaking at CNN.
So how is this possible? Well, as you might have guessed, the antagonists come into play. So who or what is Trump's political enemy? The first group that immediately comes to mind is the mainstream media, or as the American president calls them, the fake news media. The second enemy is the so-called swamp, a term that refers to the not-so-clean and not-so-transparent political scene in Washington. The third of many more enemies is, you guessed it, immigrants. So Trump can always play the me or the others card, and it seems to work for him. So what do all these talking points have in common? Well, that's that the alt-right has been using them for years. Trump managed to appeal to evangelicals and members of the far right that for a long time have felt misinterpreted by the liberal and mainstream media. And Trump's rhetoric on migration also drew in the support of the extreme far right, such as the neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville that wasn't later condemned by the president, who went so far as to say that there were very fine people on both sides.
From Mexican rapists to bad hombres, the Trump campaign in 2 moments.
Trump's rhetoric has also spawned a lot of Republican candidates that are trying to appeal to the same voters that are at the core base of the president, going so far as to state that they are Trumpier than Trump. But does it actually work? Well, apparently it works pretty well for those bearing the Trump name. Take, for example, the West Virginia Republican primary. One of the candidates came up with an ad that was filled to the brim with Trump's preferred phrases and idioms, and yet still he came up last in the race.
Swamp Captain Mitch McConnell has created millions of jobs for China people. While doing so, Mitch has gotten rich. In fact, his China family has given him tens of millions of dollars. Mitch's swamp people are now running false negative ads against me.
In order to give you a fuller account of the Trump presidency, we'd kind of need a few days, but in the meantime, considering all this controversy, well, how are the Republicans doing? Many political analysts believe that a Democratic blue wave may crash onto these midterm elections, but is it only a reaction to Trump's scandals, or are the Democratic-inclined voters more energized?
Republicans are losing 2018 midterm money wars.
As reported by CNN, the GOP is worried about these incoming midterm elections. In their piece, CNN reported that senior members of the party are warning the younger members to accumulate as many donations as possible in order to be able to successfully run campaigns in a difficult political culture. Suffice it to say that in the 88 most competitive House races, 40 Republicans have been outraised by their Democratic challengers. With House Speaker Paul Ryan's abrupt exit, the Republican corporate donor base was a bit shaken. A number of party donors and operatives believed that the Speaker's exit was the final piece of evidence that they needed to flip their attention from the House to the Senate. And that means empty House wallets for House Republicans, which will pretty much be left to fend for themselves. We need to remember that when it comes to politics, nothing is written in stone. We at VisualPolitik, we're going to be keeping a close eye on these upcoming midterms. But as always, you do need to remember that when it comes to politics, nothing's written in stone. We at VisualPolitik, we're going to pay special attention to these upcoming midterms. So now it's your turn. Are the Republicans losing their credibility? Do you think that they're going to lose votes? Is a Democratic blue wave coming to the midterms? Well, please leave your answer in the comment section below, and of course don't forget to visit our friends from ReconsiderMedia.com, the podcast that provided the vocals in this video that were not mine, and of course visit our Patreon page if you want to support this project. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.
VisualPolitik. Subscribe to this channel. Oh yeah.